In this video, I, an Inanimate Insanity animator, will teach you the most efficient way to animate in the Inanimate Insanity IV style. Inanimate Insanity has its own animation style apart from BFDI. It involves smooth transitions between arms and hands, as well as arcing movements. We'll be covering all of this. For beginners, I have tutorials linked in the description on the basics of Adobe Animate and how to animate like BFDI. If you already know Adobe Animate, then feel free to just follow along with this. Part 1. Setup. For Inanimate Insanity characters, the layer setup for their idle poses is structured with everything on its own layer. But unlike BFDI, each eyebrow is also on its own layer. The arms and hands are in one symbol, but inside the symbol they're on separate layers. The arms are not fills, but are custom lines, which allow them to be moved around much easier than the default BFDI limbs. Now, this is a new step for me, but I've begun selecting the mouth asset and converting it into its own new symbol and placing an audio file inside of it. This allows you to lip sync your character at any point during animation. Before, I would just create a bunch of keyframes on top of the animation, but this meant I would have to remove all lip sync to revise any movements. That's why I prefer having the mouth in its own symbol. Many Inanimate Insanity animators also choose to animate their characters in torsos. This means the entire body, including the face and arms, is selected and nested into its own symbol, while the legs stay on the outside. This results in the smoothest animation you can do by combining horizontal and vertical movements, kind of like when animating a bouncing ball, like I talk about in my Adobe Animate tutorial. However, I'm not teaching you how to animate the smoothest way, I'm teaching you how to animate efficiently. What I'll show you is very close to this style without all the added complication. Once your character idle is set up, we can move on to Part 2. Poses. You can animate in whatever order you'd like, but I prefer to map out our key poses. Key poses are the most important frames in a sequence and define the core of the action. For this animation, I'll be using Teddy Bear.
Trauma should not be a competition, but if it was, we'd win.
She's irritated during this line, so the poses should be exaggerated to show the true extent of her emotion. The most important rule of posing is one I learned from Joseph Pack, the director of BFDIA and a fellow animator. The goal is to avoid parallels. This is when the character's arms are the same arm and going in the same direction. This is unnatural. Just moving one arm down a bit and rotating it makes the pose more dynamic. This also works with legs, slightly skewing one more than the other, or eyebrows having one higher than the other. Additionally, because the eyebrows are separated, it's easy to accidentally make your character cross-eyed or wall-eyed. When a character looks left or right, their eyes shouldn't be identical under the eyebrow. For example, if a character is looking right, then their left eye is actually further right under the eyebrow, and vice versa. As well, when a character looks forward, their eyes are actually closer to each other than directly under the middle of the eyebrow. Putting them under the middle actually makes them look cross-eyed. You can see this more clearly when people animate algebraians. Notice how when 2 looks forward, their pupils are not in the middle of their eyes, but are closer to the center. It's important to note this as it keeps your characters looking alive and real. For these poses, I try to think about what I would be doing in this situation, but also how I imagine other cartoons would approach it. Going for a natural look is good, but when you're working with cartoon characters, why not go all out? That's what the medium is for, after all. After you're done with your key poses, we can move on to Part 3, In-Betweens. As you know, in-betweens create the in-between frames of your movement and can be adjusted by using eases. For Inanimate Insanity, most of my basic movements are done with quads and cubics since they're less dramatic eases and are more natural. However, when a character shows a lot of emotion like Teddy is doing, I'll use quart and quint eases since they start very slow and then accelerate massively. This creates that sharp movement that emphasizes anger and irritability. When I animate for BFDI, I use a lot of bounce backs, which is when a character bounces back towards the direction they just moved from. However, an Animate Insanity animation, as we've talked about, is more natural and smooth. So for basic movements, I use follow-throughs, where a character continues moving in the same direction as when they started. However, when a character is moving quickly and sharply, it's smarter to use bounce backs because it shows how impactful their movement was. When we do have follow-throughs, this is your chance to make them very smooth by creating an arc. Like I talked about before, you may be familiar with arcs if you've seen someone animating a bouncing ball. Arcs are a circular movement and look smooth because they remove sharp impacts. Therefore, to create an arc without needing to nest the torso, create 2 sets of new keyframes on either side of the original keyframes. Then select the entire torso and move it downward on both sets of new keyframes. This will artificially create the arc and save time, since you don't have to go back and forth between symbols. Once you've finished creating in-betweens, you can move on to Part 4. Transitions. Here, I've identified a point in my animation where the arms cut dramatically from one to another. We need to bridge this gap by creating transitions transitions between the arms. To do this, select the first arm and right-click, and then click Duplicate Symbol. This will create a new version of the arm that you can edit without changing other iterations of the arm. Next, I'm going to go into the symbol for the arm we want to transition to and copy and paste it into our duplicated arm file as a guide. This way we can see exactly what we're transitioning to without having to go back and forth between symbols. When you gain more experience, you won't have to do this step anymore. Next, I put a set of keyframes right before and click Onion Skin. That way I can adjust the arm to be as close to the next arm as possible, but not the exact same. Because we're easing into this movement, there still needs to be a difference between the two keyframes. Then, because the line is not a symbol, we're going to create a shape tween instead of a classic tween. This tween acts the same as a classic tween, but is for fills and lines. We'll add an ease in and then remove the arm that we copy and pasted in. Next, we'll exit the symbol and see how this animation looks. It still looks a little choppy, so now we need to edit the new arm as well. However, sometimes I can get away with not creating this internal transition by just using one keyframe. I place the keyframe 2 frames after this center set, and then I go back to the center set of keyframes and move the arm and squish it a little. Then I go to the second keyframe where the arm is back to its normal size and slightly rotate it and move it closer to that original keyframe. This can take some time as you adjust the arm, but it's still a time saver. And voila! We didn't have to duplicate a symbol or create a shape tween, and it still looks good. Then you can go through all your movements and create any modification where you see fit. Once you're done with that, we can move on to part 5. Lip syncing. Personally, I think lip syncing is the easiest but most important part of animation. Every mouth does something different, so I'm gonna let my past self explain.
Open mouths create sounds like ah, and eh, while closed mouths create m, b, and p sounds. The closed teeth mouth is responsible for sounds like t, s, l, th, ch, c, and k, and the o mouth is responsible for oohs and ohs. The f mouth is only really responsible for f sounds.
Wow, that clip was old and poorly edited. Anyway, the cool thing about II is that they have so many mouths to choose from to help perfectly display whatever emotion the character is having. They all have the same basic parts, the M, the O, the teeth, and the F mouths, but they portray a different feeling, and that's really cool. So I'll go through and lip sync this. I go through each keyframe and I hear exactly how the audio sounds, and then I match that to a mouth. It's important to be precise about this because bad lip sync can look even worse than no lip sync. And once you're done with that, boom, your animation is complete, and it looks like this.
Drama should not be a competition, but if it was, we'd win.
I can't leave the FLA in the description because the Inanimate Insanity assets aren't public, so I hope this tutorial speaks for itself. Thank you so much for watching, and hit subscribe for more tutorials and object show videos.